Welcome, students of the Word, to lesson number 3 in our series entitled Healing Balm. In our last lesson, we covered a lot of ground, but we still need to cover a whole lot more. If you remember, we were left with the question, when or where did sickness and disease begin? Today, let's return to the beginning in the garden located in Eden and listen one more time to the house rule God gave to Adam and Eve. On Genesis 2:17, but the Lord God warned them, you may freely eat the fruit of every tree in the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruit, you are sure to die. Notice this word die. In the Hebrew, it's mut, meaning dying, you shall die. The warning was Adam would die twice. They both ate the fruit from the forbidden tree and broke the house rule. And the dying process, it began. Adam and Eve's physical bodies started aging, and their bodies began the decaying process. And we can read in Genesis 5:5 that at 930 years of age, Adam died just as God said. But back on that day in history, when they rebelled, immediately they both experienced another devastating death. We call it the spiritual death. They were removed from Eden and of God's presence. This death cut off man's intimate fellowship with God, and it brought with it judgments. As we saw last week, Adam and Eve's judgment did not include sickness and disease, but it did bring a judgment that included all mankind, including you and I. That judgment was death. So Adam's judgment tells us man's spiritual death from God's fellowship ushered in man's physical death, but not sickness or disease. So now to the question, where did sickness and disease begin? To know the answer, we need to understand more about the word curse. We find it in the Bible, two different types of curses. First, we have what is called the curse of the fall. Remember, a curse was placed on the serpent and on the earth. Not a curse on Adam nor Eve, but man would forever be affected because of that curse of the fall. From the time of Adam and Eve until Jesus' final return, earth and man will live under this curse of the fall. Well, how do I know that? Because two judgments of God are linked to those two curses of the fall. The earth will not produce except man works it by the sweat of his brow. The ground still has those thistles and thorns on them. And the second one was the snake still crawls on its belly. So this curse of the fall with its judgments will remain with us until Jesus' second coming. But as we remember, sickness and disease was not a part of the curse of the fall. Today we're going to leave the book of Genesis and step over into another book called the book of Exodus. Here we will see where it all began. At this time in history, the Hebrews were now slaves in Egypt. The Pharaoh was never going to release them. But God chose a deliverer named Moses to free his people. How would God do that? How did God deliver them? Well, in Exodus 7:1, God told Moses that he would do 3 different things. He would bring the Hebrews out of Egypt. He would do it by great judgments, and he would do it in a way that the Egyptians shall know that I am is the Lord, the one true God. We can see those judgments in what we know of as the 10 plagues of Egypt. So the question may be, why 10 plagues? Well, Egypt had 10 major gods, plus, listen to this, 2,000 deities, or little gods, idols, and goddesses that branched out from these 10 gods. But the I am one God was going to outperform Egypt's 10 gods. So he turned Egypt's little god worship into the I am the only God judgments. I've shown you here a list of those 10 gods and what they were and their names. But notice the Nile god. We've read about the Nile turning to blood. That was God's judgment, and it resulted in the fish dying and a terrible stench throughout the land. Then we had the frog goddess. They loved frogs. God said, you like frogs? I'll give you more frogs. And he loaded the land down with this plague of his own, the judgment of frogs. With the frogs, it brought in infection. They loved the earth. They had an earth god. God says, you like the earth? Watch my judgment. He turned the sand into lice. Almost makes you itch thinking about it, don't it? Which brought on results of a fever. Then we have the beetle god. They love beetles. God's judgment was invasion of flies, which resulted in leprosy. They had a bull god, which God's judgment was livestock. It was killed, which brought on viruses. And then we have the god of medicine. He says, you like medicine? Here's my judgment. He brought boils onto everyone. The skin disease was the results. Then we have the sky god. He said, you love the sky? You want to worship just the sky? My judgment, says God, is hail with fire, which ended up taking away all of the water that was remaining on the earth. Then they loved insects. He says, oh, I'll give you insects. I'll give you locusts. And he brought in hordes and hordes of locusts, which means it ate the food that was still remaining, left them with nothing. They worshiped the sun god, and God said, you like the sun? I'll give you a judgment against that. I will give you thick darkness. There was no light for their crops that was even trying to grow. And the last one was Pharaoh's god, which brought on the judgment of the death of the firstborn. And this brought deep grief into Egypt. The God of Israel sent a judgment against every little god of Egypt. But the last judgment was the worst, the death of the firstborn. Pharaoh had called himself God, but Pharaoh could not even save the life of his own son. Every plague had brought devastation to Egypt, and with each plague came different kinds of sicknesses, diseases, or death. But it did not bring any sickness or disease of God's people, because God instructed them to go live in Goshen and he would protect them. Goshen represents a place of divine provision and shelter. In Exodus, you can read of other instructions that God gave to Moses. We just don't have time in our text to go over them all. I'm just giving you the highlights. There's some tough highlights to listen to. But several months of these plagues, finally at the last judgment, Pharaoh did let God's people go. Now the Hebrews are leaving Egypt. Some think that they wandered around for 40 years, but they didn't. After walking about 3 months, they arrived at Mount Sinai. They stayed there for almost a year. They moved on to Kadesh Barnea, and they stayed there for 38 years. But while at Mount Sinai, in Exodus 19, it states that Moses had made 8 trips up the mountain. That is 1.5 miles to the top each time. Then on trip number 6, Moses stayed there for 40 days. Why? Because the fall, it brought the need for the second curse, the curse of the law. The law itself was not the curse, but their disobedience to the law would bring with it curse. These curses were what would happen to those who did not obey every law. So God would give to Moses 10 commandments of stone, and also the books of the law which they were to obey, called the Torah. What is this law? It's the first 5 books of our Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These 5 books or scrolls contain 613 commands. Those commands were divided into 14 divisions with 83 sections. It included, but wasn't limited to making the wilderness tabernacle, instructions on how to make the Ark of the Covenant, and details on how to make the priest's clothing, along with the list of all of the priest's duties. They also contained strict do's and don'ts for them to follow from that day forward. Example, how to serve God, how to worship God. Gave them dietary laws, things that they were to eat and things they could not eat, about sacrifices and the feast days, just to name a few. In these commands or Torah, there were 365 negative commands to remind them of things not to do every day of the year. There was 248 positive commands to do, which are the number of bones by their calculation then that were in the human body. A total of 613 laws they must follow every day. The people were now obeying the commands with their entire body, and the results were they stayed healthy. So why have these 613 laws? From the beginning, in the garden until the wilderness, there was a span of about 2,400 years. They also brought 3 judgments on them in the meantime. And before the wilderness experience, they had once again rebelled against God and had been captured and placed in bondage in Egypt. They repented, and God sent Moses to deliver them. They had been in Egyptian bondage for 430 years. When they were released, the people knew nothing about rules or regulations or laws. They were traveling and doing whatever they wanted to do. Why? They did not know what was right and what was wrong. They had been conditioned on doing what the Egyptian soldiers told them to do. So God needed to set in place some rules, some guidelines for his chosen people to follow. Excuse me. So to the mountain, God gave Moses a training manual of those 613 guidelines for the people to follow, including the 10 commandments on tablets. These commands were so important to follow that in Numbers 15, instructions were given to have a daily reminder of these laws with them at all times. It was given to them in the making of a talit, or we know it as the prayer shawl. On the talit was tzitzits on each corner of the garment. The 4 were tied in such a way that it totaled, get this, 613 strings called mitzvot, or commandments. Now the children of Israel have 613 commands written on a Torah scroll, and they wore a talit to help them daily to stay pure before the Lord. They put to memory and obeyed these commandments, and by following these commands, something happened. They were healthy, and the clothes never wore out. So we move forward to just before Moses' death. God gave Moses instructions regarding these 613 commands for the people to follow. Deuteronomy 31:10, at the end of every 7 years, when all Israel is come to appear before the Lord thy God, here's the command, thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing. In verse 25, God instructed Moses of a special place for the book or the scroll of these 613 commands to be kept. In Deuteronomy 31:25-26, Moses commanded the Levites who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and put it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there as a witness against you. This word witness in the Hebrew says it is evidence against you. When the high priest would walk into the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was, where God was to meet with Moses, the scroll of 613 commands was there as evidence what God had said to do. How often? Every 7 years. Then God told Moses to call a meeting of the elders and the officers. He reminded them of God's instruction. Read the book. When? At the end of every 7 years during the Feast of Tabernacles. So the question is, what if they choose not to obey that command? Oh, God covers everything. He had it written down also. So let's step back to Mount Sinai. Exodus 15:26. If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his what? Commandments, 613 commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Notice 2 words, put and brought. The Hebrew is sum, allow or permit. This word put and brought are both the same Hebrew word, meaning that he would allow or permit what? The diseases of Egypt to come upon them. Why? He says, I am the God that heals you. It's not my plan to do anything to cause you harm. My plan is to keep you healed because I am the God that heals you. He has always and had always been their protector. God said he is a healer to his people, not a killer. But if the Hebrew children chose to step away from God, leave his presence, he had no choice but to lift his hand and soon allow or permit those sicknesses and diseases of Egypt to sweep in and come upon them. Remember, God's judgments upon Egypt's gods brought sickness, disease, ruined crops, sick animals, and death, all because of their gods and Pharaoh's refusal to let God's people go. God lifted his hand, and Egypt's judgment was sickness and disease and loss and, yes, death. Now back to Moses. Those Hebrews had now been trained in God's ways. 613 commands put to memory. And God made a promise to them. Remember, they had personally witnessed all of those plagues, sicknesses, diseases in Egypt. And they were protected by God in Goshen. The question, what if they disobeyed the commands of God? What happened? Egypt's diseases and sicknesses will come into the camp and upon them. They had never experienced anything like what Egypt had experienced. Why? God said, I'm the God that heals you. They had never experienced sickness or disease. Never, ever been sick. So God has now given his instructions. He gave the commands. They started moving forward, and look what happened next. In Numbers 12, Miriam and Aaron murmured against Moses, and Miriam was stricken with leprosy. Where have we heard about leprosy? May I remind you of number 4, the beetle god of Egypt. God's judgment was invasion of flies that brought a disease called leprosy. It did not stop there. In number 16, 14,700 people died of a plague for murmuring against Moses and Aaron. They do not tell us the name of this plague, but it killed immediately 14,700 people that day. In the book of Numbers alone, you can read 10 more times God turned away, lifted his hand, and permitted the disease or a plague to come upon them. 9 times it was because of their rebellion and their murmuring. So again, let's go back to just before Moses' death. He was rehearsing all of the commands to the next generation. Deuteronomy 28:15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, his laws, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Then he lists 54 curses. Now you can go back and read those in your study time. But move down to Deuteronomy 28:60. Moreover, he will bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt, which thou wast afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. The word bring in the Hebrew, turn aside, turn away, or permit. Literally, God turned his back if they would sin, if they would break those laws, if they would get into any kind of confusion or murmuring. God would have to turn aside, turn away, lift his hand, and permit those diseases of Egypt. God said, I will turn away and permit all the diseases of Egypt, which thou wert afraid of. They shall come upon thee. And in verse 61, also, listen to this, every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. They were warned. If they turned from God and worshiped other gods, the judgments that came upon Egypt's gods and Egypt would come upon them, plus more that was not even mentioned. This was their choice. Choose Egypt or choose God. Do you think God meant what he said? So what choices did Israel make? Well, their 40-year wilderness excursion comes to an end. Moses is now dead. Joshua became their new leader, and 25 years later, Joshua died. Listen to this story, the ending of this story. Within 2 years, things changed. In Judges 2:11, I'm talking 2 years after Joshua died. Judges 2:11, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them, and they angered the Lord. King James says provoked. It is a Greek word meaning stirred up the heart to a heated condition, which in turn leads to a specific action. What action would God take? Remember, God had forewarned them of the consequences. So God lifted his hand, turned away, and permitted Israel to fall into the hands of their enemy. Later, once again, as Israel always does, they repented, returned to God, and God's hand was once again upon them. All God wanted from his people was their obedience. If they obeyed his commands, he would give them blessings, and he would not allow or permit Egypt's judgments to fall upon them. But if they were rebellious and disobedient, the very same plagues, curses, and judgments which had been inflicted upon those in Egypt would be inflicted upon them. God had given them a choice and even gave them the answer before they left the wilderness. He said, choose life. Sadly, the curse of the law has now spread to the people of Israel and to people everywhere. and it will continue until the healer, Jehovah Rapha, would arrive and not destroy the law, but fulfill what was needed to remove the curse on an old rugged cross and rise again to give us eternal life and healing. We now know where sickness and disease came from, but there's still good news ahead. You won't want to miss next week. Your answer may be in that message. So I hope you learned something new today. We're still looking at Jehovah Rapha. It's just taken us a long road to get there, but I hope you're understanding God's plan. God always has a plan, and He instructs us ahead of time how to follow His perfect will. So until next week, may God richly bless you. And again, may you remember, God is the God that heals us. His name is Jehovah Rapha.